Thank you. Kids are awesome, aren't they? I always thought so when they're, come home from the hospital and you get to hug them and they would play with them. And we were up in Elkhart yesterday, or actually Osceola area, and I got to see a couple of the grandkids. And I've always said that if I'd known that I would have had grandkids and forget the kids. But I guess that doesn't work that way. Today I want to talk to you about raising healthy Christian children. And I know some of you might say, well, I'm past that, I'm grandparent age. Well, that means you can do it as grandparents as well. And you young people that are up there, listen closely, because you can hold your parents and grandparents to task, but you also have to do some things for them. And I have all of that today. So get the popcorn out, sit back and relax, because it's going to be informative, I hope. One of the first books that my wife and I bought when we were having children is Dr. Spock. It's baby and child care. Anytime the kids would have a sniffle or this or that or something was different, we would look up in Dr. Spock to see if we could figure out what was going on and maybe save us a doctor's trip or whatever. How many of you ever did the Dr. Spock book? The second book that I always used was the Holy Bible. Now remember, I'm talking about raising healthy Christian children with the emphasis on the Christian. Today I want to break it down into three key issues: respect, training, and family Christian traditions. So let's talk about respect. Here's the Bible verse that we should all remember. In Exodus 20, verse 12. Young people, listen closely. Honor your father and your mother, so that you may live long in the land of the Lord your God that is giving you. Now, we were all kids at one point or another because we wouldn't make it to where we are now otherwise. One of the things that I was taught at a very young age is to respect my mom and dad and any elders, people older than me. And that nothing was more dramatic than the day I was probably about 9 years old, full of myself, already bigger than my mom, and we were all roughhousing 7 kids in the house. Dad was at work, and Mom says, go outside and get your energy off. I want you running back and forth on the backyard. So we all go outside, and I'm kind of walking to half trot, and all the other kids are running. And Mom yells out the window, run, Doug, I didn't say walk. And of course, being the person I was still full of myself, and what's she gonna do? So she calls me in, and we're at the back door, and there's a window in the back door, and my mother takes a fly swatter and starts hitting me. And so I grabbed it. This is before all the things that, the kids would nowadays, when you look cross-eyed at them, they're gonna turn you into DCS or something. But at any rate, so I grabbed the fly swatter from her, and in the process, I bring it back, and I put my elbow through the glass door. Now I know I'm in trouble. And so I had to go into my room, and the words that everybody dreads, wait till your dad gets home. My dad taught me really quick, you will always respect your mother and your father. This part about it says you want to make sure you live a long life. One of my dad's favorite sayings was, I brought you into this world, and by golly, I can take you back out. You know, I bet more than me have ever heard that in time. But he taught me what respect was supposed to be and what we're supposed to do with our parents especially. And nowadays we too often allow our kids to get by with some of the disrespect. And it's not necessarily as bad as I did, but when you're talking to them, how many times are they still messing around on their phones or their iPad or something else? That would be showing disrespect. So I want to talk about why children should honor their parents. Number one, kids, you want to live to see your next birthday? Honor your parents. In Ephesians chapter 6, verse 3 says, when children don't honor and obey their parents, they will lose blessings from God. Now, we don't, any of us want to lose blessings from God. There were times that I would get so frustrated with my kids because they just were not where I wanted them to be. And so I would go off and I would pray and talk to God, and He would remind me that maybe there are times that I wasn't where He wanted me to be. And so I had to go back and rethink and relook at things. So parents, be careful, because in Ephesians 6, verse 4, it says, fathers and mothers, do not exacerbate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. Now, I'm going to give you a few key things, and parents and grandparents, we need to remember this. And kids, you need to understand this is what mom and dad are trying to do. As parents, we have a biblical right and responsibility to discipline our children. Let me say that again. Kids, listen. As parents, we have a right and a responsibility to discipline our children. And Proverbs tells us this in Proverbs 13, verse 24, in 19, verse 18, in 22, verse 15, in 29, verse 15, and in 29, verse 17. Now, parents, we need to go on from that. Besides the fact that you have a responsibility, and you can go home and say, kids, Pastor told me it's my responsibility, you're grounded, or whatever. But parents, you need to look at some of the rest of these. We need to not frustrate our children with unreasonableness. We don't need to ask our kids to something that is really very unreasonable to do. We need to be consistently or not consistently finding fault with our kids. You know, when we get a wayward child, we tend to find all the other faults that kind of go along with it instead of reminding ourselves of all the good things that they do and have as well. We can frustrate our kids if we're not consistent. So if we're inconsistently or breaking promises, we don't want to do that because it's frustrating our kids. Is it or isn't it? Kind of like the COVID today. Do you or don't you social distance? Do you or don't you wear masks? Do you or don't you go to church? Do you or don't you have riots in the streets where there's no social distancing or masks? Which is it? It makes everybody frustrated. We frustrate our children with non-discipline. Now, I am of the belief that if you do not discipline your children are going to think you don't care. You don't really love them. You're not setting a boundary to keep them in the right place. And we need to do that as parents and as grandparents. You know, when the grandkids come over, they know that there are certain things that Paul says no to, and they don't question it, they just don't do it. Because that means that I love them. Now, they don't think of it that way. But we need to understand that it frustrates them if you aren't consistent and you're not disciplining them. Now, we also need to be careful not to overprotect them. At some point in our lives, we're not going to be there and they are. And if we have overprotected them, we're not really getting them ready to be on their own and to be able to deal with life. And if you have more than one child, and we had 7 in my family growing up, you can't show favoritism. Because if you show favoritism, it causes problems too. You got to remember that Isaac favored Esau, and Rebekah favored Jacob. And the world is still suffering from a poor parenting skill of that ancient people. And we need to not frustrate our children by us being selfish and not listening. In your bulletin, there's a saying or a poem about that Diane Lumens had said, and I'm not going to go through it because you can read it and you can look at it later if you want. But I look at raising children as kind of like trying to hang on to a wet bar of soap. If you hold it too tight, it's going to slip out of your hands. And if you don't hold it tight enough, it's going to slip out of your hands. So the key is learning how to hold it just right. So now let's talk about training, part 2 of my 3-part. In Proverbs 22, verse 6, it says, "Train up your child in the way that he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from that." Now you might say, okay, Pastor, what gives with that verse? I mean, let's look at some real facts here. Billy Graham had a wayward child. King David was raised in a good Jewish home, and there was time in his life that he seemed to be so far away from God, but yet he ended up being King David. Now, my own children are not perfect. Not in reality to what I would like to see them. They make choices of their own, and it may not be the choice that I would make. But the fact of the matter is, if you give them that good foundation, there is an opportunity and a real prospect that they're going to come back at some point to that solid foundation. But if they don't, does that mean I'm a failure? No. How many times have I heard this verse being written or said to me about Proverbs 22? If I've heard it once, I probably have heard it 1,000 times. It's the most commonly recited verse about raising children. Now let me give you an example about training children. Or before I do that, I do want to say one other thing. There is an importance of infant baptism. Now I know there are some denominations that don't and won't baptize until they're older, so they make their own choice. My thought on infant baptism and why the Methodists do it is threefold. First of all, it's the act of God pouring out his blessing on this young child and the family. Secondly, it's causing the parents to promise to raise their children to be good Christian people in the life of the church. And thirdly, it requires the whole congregation, because you're asked, will you help the parents do this? So that's our job, to help the children and the parents to get through. You know, a lot of it has to do with character of the parents too. If we don't have God in the forefront, it's hard for us to force the kids to do that. If they don't see us doing it, they're wondering, why should they? We always want to give an environment and set it to as closely as we can to God as parents. If this verse is a biblical principle, though, is what I'm trying to explain, it's not your fault if they go away. As each and every individual, God has given us all free will. And there are times when, to the dismay of us as parents or grandparents, they make bad choices. But if you look back decades, you probably made some bad choices that your parents weren't real thrilled about. It happens. But where are you today? You're sitting in church and you're listening, so they know in the long run your decision was made to be back with God. But it's not your fault if they don't. This is a proverb of wisdom, not a promise that it will always happen. There's other similar ones, like things that say, early to bed, early to rise makes you healthy, wealthy, and wise. That's not always true. My wife goes to bed at 6 o'clock. I'm kidding, she doesn't. She goes to bed long before I do. She requires more sleep than I do. But she doesn't have a spleen, so she has the capability of getting sick a lot easier than I do. And we've gone back and forth at home for the first probably 6 months of the COVID. She wouldn't leave the house. I had to do everything. I went to the grocery store, I went whatever she needed. Honey. And I would do it. The other one is, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. We've all used that or heard that at any point. If that were the case, Johnny Appleseed would still be here. Or there's a like father, like son. There was a time that my son wasn't what I wanted him to be, but I had given and made some choices I wouldn't have liked him to make. But I had given him the foundation, and at 41, soon to be 42 years old, he is where he's supposed to be and has done a wonderful turnaround. It happens. And if you ask my wife, he does nothing but thank me behind my back that I never gave up on him. I always loved him, and I taught him the foundation that he's now come back to. Now I want to give you an illustration of things like this. It says there were 2 Jewish men sitting at a park, and they were talking about their sons. One said, I cannot believe my son. I raised him in the Jewish faith. I took him to the synagogue every week, gave him a wonderful bar mitzvah, and even sent him to a wonderful Jewish prep school. How does he repay me? When he's done with college, he becomes a Christian. So the second one says, well, I too have a son that I raised in the Jewish faith, took him to the synagogue every week, gave him a great bar mitzvah, sent him to a great prep school, and when he graduated college, how did he thank me? He became a Christian. So they decided to go to the rabbi. And they sit down and they talk to the rabbi. I told him what the dilemma was. Says, we both had sons that we raised in the Jewish faith. We took them to synagogue every week. We sent them to a fine Jewish prep school, gave them a wonderful bar mitzvah. And how did they repay us? They became Christians. And the rabbi thought a minute and he said, you know what? I too had a son that I raised in the Jewish faith, that I sent to synagogue every week, gave him a wonderful bar mitzvah, sent him to a great prep school, and how did he repay me? He became a Christian. So he says, I need to go talk to God. So he leaves the two people and he goes into a room by himself and he's praying and talking to God, tells the dilemma, and God says, you know what? I had a son. He was raised in the Jewish faith. He became a Christian too. Jesus taught us how to be a Christian. He wanted us to know. In general, I have seen this biblical proverb ring true, but there are times when it won't. But it's not your fault. There's a thing called the Father's Poem, with lines such as, I gave you life, but I cannot live it for you. I can take you to church, but I cannot make you believe. I can teach you right from wrong, but I can't always decide for you. I can teach you about sex, but I cannot keep you pure. Our jobs as parents and grandparents is to lay the foundation. They may go wayward, and with hope, love, and prayer, at some point they might come back. Give you one more illustration on this. There was some parents that were raising their children, and they likened raising their children to a garden. So each part of the garden was sectioned off. Some rows of the garden looked beautiful and some not so great. Weeds had overtaken it. So when they were inquired as to what was going on with the garden, they went to each part, and the parent looked proudly at this first section. He says, this represents homework, and how my kids did homework and did it very well, always in on time. They were good students. They were going to have a bright future. Parents were just so wonderful about sitting down with them and making sure their homework got done. So we went to another part of the garden and then said, again, it was pretty, was well done. She says, well, we made sure that our teens were engaged in either sport or music or some component where they were good and being involved. We thought it was vitally important for them to take all sorts of events, and we'd spent tons of time and money and were with them to go through all of this. And we always made sure they finished what they started. So we get to the third part of the garden. It said it was well groomed and looked fairly nice. It looked good, actually. And they said this is how they relate to their peers. We want them to be able to fit in with people that they're around. We made sure our kids had the right clothes, wearing the right brand names or whatever. Gave them the cell phones and all of the paraphernalia so they can get a hold of us 24/7, because we want to make sure that if they need us, we can get to us. And the problem with this part of the garden is on top it looked nice, but underneath it wasn't. The roots were very small. They weren't going to last. This is all stuff that is insignificant in real life. And finally, I went to the last corner with them. And this part of the corner, or this part of the garden, was in weeds and just overdrawn, and it was dry, cracked ground and everything else. So I decided, well, what happened to this? What is this represented? And the parents kind of dropped their heads and said, this is their Christian education. We decided that at 12 or 13 years old, we didn't want to impose our beliefs on them, so we let them have a choice if they wanted to go to church. And of course, as any 12 or 13-year-old would do, they decided, I want to sleep in on Sunday because I was up too late playing games or doing something else Saturday night. So they weren't forced to go to church because the parents said, oh, I don't want to impose. That part of the garden was terrible. Nothing was ever going to grow there if you don't have God. And the last thing I want to talk about is family traditions. In Deuteronomy 6, verses 7 and 8, as Pam talked, part of what she was reading was talking about, it is important to have family traditions. One of the traditions in my family was, even after we were adults and went out and had our own families, on Christmas Eve we would meet back at Mom and Dad's house and sing carols around the Christmas tree or play our instruments, and then all go to the midnight service where most of us performed in the choir or that type of thing. That was very important to me, and it was very important to all of my siblings. A good Christian tradition, whatever yours may be, talk about it. Explain to the kids how important it is. If you don't, who will? TV programs, a wide variety of music, or as I call it, noise in today's world that they may listen to, friends who aren't Christians, the books they may read. If we don't, they will get it somewhere else. And if we don't, that's one of the reasons why only 65, 68% of the people still go to church and believe in God, because we've allowed it to go the other way. We need to all take part. When you had a baptism here, you all said yes, you would help the family raise the kids. It's not just the parents, but it's us too. And parents, if you need help, don't hesitate. Any one of the people in the congregation would like to be there and help you to raise the kids. And let's get God back into our country and get God back into our lives to where He is first and foremost. And the rest of the gifts that God gives us will come. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we ask that you take our lives and keep it open, our hearts and our minds, that we know better how to raise our kids in a good Christian upbringing. That if we give them that foundation, we know it's a lot easier for them to come back to you later if they decide to go away. But that foundation is going to show them what real love and real grace and real commitment is all about. We ask these things in your Son's name. Amen.